When you think of the Middle Ages, you might imagine castles, knights, or grand cathedrals. But the true science of survival was happening quietly behind stone walls and wooden fences in the gardens. These were not ordinary gardens, but carefully planned spaces that fed entire communities, healed the sick, and carried hidden knowledge passed down for centuries. Tonight, we'll step into these forgotten gardens and uncover the slow, patient science that made them so productive. From strange planting rhythms to compost heaps steaming in the cold air, the story of medieval gardens reveals a world where survival depended on cycles, traditions, and quiet observation. Settle in and let's walk through the winding paths of a medieval garden and discover why these humble plots were far more important than history usually remembers. Chapter 1. The Quiet Beginnings. Monastic Gardens as Survival Tools. When you imagine a medieval monastery, your mind may drift. First to the heavy stone walls, the tall cloisters echoing with chants, or the long hours of prayer broken by the tolling of bells. Yet behind those walls, tucked away in ordered rectangles of soil, something else quietly unfolded, a practice as mundane as planting seeds, but as essential as prayer itself. Monastic gardens, though hardly as celebrated as illuminated manuscripts or Gregorian chants, were the silent lifelines of entire religious communities. They were, in essence, living laboratories of survival, where both the body and the soul were nourished. To understand why monks became gardeners, you must first remember that a medieval monastery was not simply a place of worship. It was a self-contained world. Monks could not rely upon a marketplace just beyond the gate for their daily bread, nor could they depend upon villagers for all their sustenance. Cloistered living demanded a steady supply of food, medicine, and materials, and much of that supply came not from trade but from the soil. Picture, if you will, a monk in the early morning, walking in silence across the damp grass toward the garden enclosure. The garden was not accidental, not an afterthought. Its design reflected centuries of practical need and spiritual discipline. High walls kept out wandering animals, but they also provided a sense of sacred enclosure, as though the garden itself was a microcosm of the monastery's ordered world. Within these walls, beds of vegetables, rows of herbs, and plots of medicinal plants were arranged with care, often in geometric designs that reflected both function and aesthetic order. The soil itself was precious, and monks took care to enrich it. In many monasteries, waste from kitchens and barns was composted, though the term compost was not yet in widespread use. Instead, they thought of it simply as returning what was spent back into the earth. Ashes from the hearth, manure from livestock, straw from the stables, all were gathered and laid into heaps, slowly transforming into nourishment for the next season's growth. It was not glamorous work. It was slow, repetitive, and smelled of decay, but it was the difference. Between famine and plenty, the crops grown varied from monastery to monastery, but a few staples appear again and again in surviving records. Cabbage, leeks, onions, and beans were common vegetables, filling the bellies of monks with stews that sustained them through long winters. Grains were grown too, though larger fields of wheat or rye often lay outside the immediate cloister. Within the gardens, smaller plots might be devoted to herbs like parsley, sage, thyme, and dill, flavorings that made otherwise bland meals more tolerable. But these gardens were not just for food. They were repositories of medicinal knowledge, for monks were often the healers of their communities. In the same garden where beans climbed simple wooden poles, you might also find rue, fennel, and comfrey. Monks knew which leaves could ease a fever, which roots could settle the stomach, and which flowers could soothe the pain of a wound. The garden, therefore, was both kitchen and pharmacy. To walk its paths was to move between nourishment and cure, between sustenance and healing. Take, for example, the herb garden of the Benedictines. Benedictine monasteries, following the rule of Saint Benedict written in the 6th century, emphasized a life of balance between prayer and work, ora et labora. Gardening fell neatly into this rhythm. A monk might spend the morning copying a manuscript in the scriptorium, and the afternoon turning the soil in the garden. Both tasks were acts of devotion, each performed with the same patience and humility. The garden did not merely feed the monks, it shaped their spiritual lives. Tending the soil was seen as tending to God's creation, a reminder of humanity's role as caretaker of the earth. Yet these gardens were also profoundly practical. In times of scarcity, when harvests failed in surrounding villages, monasteries, with well-maintained gardens and stores of preserved herbs and vegetables, could provide aid. In this way, monasteries became centers of resilience. They were islands of relative stability in a world often racked by famine, plague, and war. One cannot overstate how vital this was in the Middle Ages. Medieval Europe was not a place of abundance. Crop failures were common. A stretch of bad weather could reduce entire regions to hunger. Against this backdrop, the steady productivity of monastic gardens was nothing short of remarkable. The orderliness of their rows, the careful rotation of crops, and the collection of manure, all of it contributed to a reliability that peasants living just outside the walls might envy. And yet, what is perhaps most interesting about these gardens is how quiet they were. Unlike bustling markets or noisy fields where peasants shouted across furrows, the monastery garden was a place of silence. The rule of Saint Benedict encouraged monks to speak little, and so the soundscape of the garden was different. The rustle of leaves, the scrape of hose against soil, the distant toll of the bell, these were the sounds that accompanied the work. To stand in such a garden was to enter a rhythm of life where silence and labor wove together seamlessly. Tools were simple, often little more than wooden-handled spades, hoes, and knives. But the simplicity belied their effectiveness. Just as the monks found spiritual depth in repetitive prayer, they found practical abundance in repetitive tasks. To water a bed, to weed it daily, to harvest at the right time, none of these actions were extraordinary in themselves. But performed with care, they created extraordinary reliability. It is worth pausing here to consider what might have been lost if monastic gardens had not existed. Without them, monasteries would have struggled to survive in isolation. Without them, medicinal knowledge might have faded more quickly in an age when few could read the ancient texts of Galen or Dioscorides. Without them, the stability that monasteries offered to nearby villages might have crumbled. Yet, despite their importance, these gardens rarely appear in grand chronicles or epic tales. Kings and battles fill the pages of medieval history, while the quiet tending of herbs remains almost invisible. And that, perhaps, is why they fit so well into our exploration of forgotten science. Their contribution was enormous, but their story is quiet, hidden in the daily turning of soil and the uncelebrated rhythm of growth. When you close your eyes and picture the Middle Ages, perhaps you see knights, castles, or crusades. But if you were to slip inside the cloister walls of a monastery, you would find a different scene. A monk bent over a bed of cabbages, hands deep in the soil, the morning sun warming the stones of the walls. It is not dramatic, but it is real. And in its quiet way, it is as much a part of medieval history as any battle. And so we come to a curious thought. If these gardens were laboratories of survival, what, exactly, did they teach beyond food and medicine? Did the monks, in their careful observation of soil and seed, stumble upon a deeper understanding of the natural world, a kind of forgotten science hidden in their daily toil? Chapter 2. Monastic Knowledge and the Science of Soil. If you walk again through the cloisters of a medieval monastery, you would soon notice that gardens were not accidental patches of green, but carefully arranged systems of life. Behind every hedge, every furrow, and every bed of herbs was an intentional plan. Monks and nuns did not simply plant seeds. They managed ecosystems. They thought deeply about soil, water, and the hidden connections between plants and the wider landscape. To understand the productivity of medieval gardens, we must first think about the soil beneath them. To the medieval gardener, soil was not just dirt. It was a living substance, a balance of wetness and dryness, warmth and cold, richness and sterility. They understood these qualities through the lens of humoral theory, the same system physicians used to interpret the human body. Just as a person might be described as melancholic or sanguine, soil could be wet, dry, hot, or cold, and each classification influenced which plants would grow best there. The writings of scholars such as Albertus Magnus, a 13th century Dominican friar, reveal that medieval people were observant soil scientists, even if they lacked modern terminology. They noticed that darker soils produced healthier crops, that clay held water while sand dried quickly, and that mixing manures could alter fertility. They experimented with spreading ash from the hearth, composting weeds, and layering animal dung in the fields. In this way, they created rudimentary forms of soil enrichment, simple but effective methods that allowed gardens to sustain themselves year after year. The monastery garden, often divided into rectangles by narrow paths, functioned as a living laboratory. Each section had a purpose. One corner might be filled with medicinal herbs like sage, rue, or valerian. Another was reserved for vegetables such as leeks, onions, and broad beans. Fruit trees, apples, pears, and plums were often planted along walls, both for their shade and for their steady harvests. But beneath all of this was the unseen labor of soil care. The monks observed when the earth grew tired, when it failed to nourish crops. Their answer was to rest the ground, to rotate plantings, or to cover the beds with enriching material. The careful balance of planting was not only about productivity, but about symbolism. In medieval thought, gardens were reflections of divine order. Fertile soil, properly tended, was not only practical but also spiritual. A healthy garden mirrored a healthy soul. The tending of soil was therefore an act of devotion as much as a matter of necessity. Every spadeful of compost or bucket of water was part of a larger rhythm of prayer. Work and study. It is easy to imagine a monk in a rough woolen habit kneeling among the rows of beans, his hands coated with earth, gently pressing seeds into the ground. The act was slow and repetitive, requiring patience and quiet attention. These ordinary motions created extraordinary results. Abundant gardens that could sustain an entire monastic community through the seasons. Water, too, was carefully managed. In many monastic complexes, streams were redirected into channels that irrigated the gardens. Where water was scarce, gardeners built cisterns to collect rain or dug simple wells. The ability to move and control water was a form of quiet engineering, ensuring that even during dry summers, the gardens could continue to feed the community. And what did these gardens feed? Not only the body but the mind. They were classrooms, where novices learned about the properties of herbs, where older monks studied plants for medical texts, and where the cycles of nature taught lessons about patience and perseverance. The soil and its management were as much a subject of study as scripture. Beyond the monastery walls, knowledge of soil care spread into villages and towns. Peasant farmers learned from clerics and healers, adopting composting methods and crop rotations that improved their own small plots. In this way, the silent science of monastic gardens became part of the shared fabric of medieval life. When you think about the abundance of these gardens, it becomes clear that they were not the product of chance. They thrived because people gave careful thought to the unseen world beneath the roots. They learned slowly and patiently how to balance soil, water, and planting cycles in ways that allowed life to flourish in even the most modest patches of ground. And yet, even with all their observation and careful labor, medieval gardeners often faced mysteries. Crops sometimes failed without explanation. Soil that had been fertile suddenly became barren. These unexplained failures puzzled them and reminded them that nature was never fully in human control. To the medieval mind, This uncertainty carried a lesson. The garden was both a human responsibility and a divine gift. But how did these gardeners respond when their soil seemed exhausted or their crops declined year after year? What quiet strategies did they develop to overcome nature's unpredictability and keep their gardens productive across generations? Chapter 3: Rotation, Companionship, and the Rhythm of Growth. When the soil grew weary and the crops faltered, medieval gardeners did not simply surrender to hunger. Instead, they turned to slow but steady methods that kept their small plots productive. Across decades, the science of medieval gardens, though rarely described as such by those who practiced it, lay in cycles, rotations, partnerships, and rhythms that mirrored both nature and faith. One of the most important practices was crop rotation. The idea was simple. A piece of land should not be planted with the same crop every year, lest the soil become exhausted. A plot that grew beans one year might grow onions the next, followed by fallow grass in the third. Some monasteries and villages even practiced a three-field system, dividing their land into thirds. One third held grain, another held legumes, and the last was left fallow or planted with fodder crops. By shifting crops in this way, they ensured that nutrients were replenished, pests were reduced, and the soil had time to recover. This principle, learned through observation, kept gardens abundant without modern fertilizers. Peasants and monks alike would have noticed that beans left the soil richer, while wheat drained it quickly. Though they did not understand nitrogen as we do, they saw its effects. Fields that had grown beans or peas seemed to support stronger harvests afterward. It was quiet knowledge, passed by word of mouth and by demonstration, learned through the rhythm of sowing and reaping across the generations. Another layer of wisdom lay in companion planting, the practice of setting certain plants together, because they seemed to thrive in each other's company. Garlic, for example, was sometimes planted near roses, not for beauty, but because it deterred pests. Onions and leeks, with their strong odors, were thought to protect beans and cabbage. Herbs like rosemary and sage were not only useful in medicine, but were also believed to guard other crops against worms and insects. These practices were not always consistent, and some were based on trial, error, or superstition. Yet over time, useful patterns emerged, and the gardens benefited from them. The medieval gardener's sense of rhythm extended beyond crops to the seasons themselves. Every month of the year carried its own tasks. February might call for pruning vines and fruit trees. March signaled the sowing of peas. April demanded careful weeding, while May was a time for planting beans and cabbage. Summer brought the work of watering, staking, and gathering herbs for drying. Autumn was the great harvest, and winter was for repairing tools, composting waste, and preparing beds for the next cycle. In this way, the gardener's year unfolded in steady repetition, a calendar written not in ink, but in soil and sunlight. Livestock, too, played their part in sustaining the gardens. Sheep grazed on fallow land, their droppings fertilizing it as they moved. Chickens scratched at weeds and ate insects, while their manure enriched the earth. Even pigs, when kept near gardens, contributed by breaking up the soil and adding their waste to compost piles. Animals were not just a source of food. They were integral to the invisible cycle that allowed crops to flourish. The compost heap, often overlooked, was another quiet cornerstone of productivity. Gardeners gathered kitchen scraps, straw, manure, and ash, layering them carefully and allowing time to transform them into dark, fertile matter. This compost was then spread across the beds, returning life to tired soil. Though it may have been a smelly and unglamorous task, it was essential to the garden's survival. Every monastery and farmyard had such a heap, a silent reminder that nothing was wasted and that every scrap could be returned to the earth. Beyond these practical methods, the garden was also a space of meaning. In monasteries, the arrangement of plants sometimes followed symbolic patterns. 4 beds might be laid out in the shape of a cross. each one filled with different herbs. Walls around the garden not only protected against animals, but also symbolized the Garden of Eden, a sacred enclosure where order triumphed over chaos. For peasants, the garden was more modest, yet it too carried meaning. It was often the difference between survival and hunger, between a family enduring winter or falling into want. The ordinary act of tending onions, leeks, or beans became, therefore, an act of resilience. The rhythm of these practices ensured that medieval gardens were surprisingly productive. Without machines, without chemical fertilizers, and without modern science, they managed to create abundance through patience, observation, and trust in cycles. Their science was not written in books, but in the steady patterns of daily work, turning the soil, rotating crops, composting waste, and companion planting. And yet, for all their success, these gardens were never immune to failure. A sudden frost, a swarm of locusts, or a season of heavy rain could undo months of careful planning. In such moments, medieval people were reminded that nature was both a partner and a master. Their cycles of rotation and companionship gave them resilience, but never certainty. Perhaps this uncertainty was part of why gardens held such deep meaning in the Middle Ages. They were places of control in a world of unpredictability. Within the garden walls, a monk or peasant could shape life in small ways, coaxing order from the soil. But beyond those walls lay a vast, untamed nature, where storms, famine, and disease lurked. The garden was a haven of structure, a small reflection of divine creation, and a source of daily sustenance. And so, when you imagine a medieval garden, do not picture only the rows of beans or the herbs drying in the sun. Picture also the unseen cycles, the resting soil, the rotated crops, the plants grown side by side, the animals grazing nearby, and the compost heap quietly steaming in the corner. These rhythms, patient and unchanging, were the hidden science of medieval gardening. As you drift into sleep, you might wonder, in our modern age of technology and abundance, what lessons might still be found in the quiet, repetitive wisdom of medieval gardeners who worked with cycles instead of chemicals, and with patience instead of speed. Thank you for spending this quiet journey with me tonight. If you enjoyed drifting through the forgotten science of medieval gardens, I'd be so grateful if you could like this video and subscribe to Quiet Boring Sleep. It helps this little corner of calm history grow, and lets me share more slow, gentle stories with you. Until next time, may your night be peaceful, your dreams be light, and your sleep be deep. Good night.